Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Laura Knutson, and I'm one of the club's 2020 Artist Fellows. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the NAC offers more than 150 free programs, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Today we are joined by Eveline Baseggio. Eveline received her doctorate in Italian Renaissance and Baroque art at Rutgers University with a dissertation on Venetian Renaissance sculpture. She is currently teaching at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, where her classes on the history of Western art and civilization and Baroque art draw attention to a global and cross-cultural context. She has worked extensively in a number of art museums, namely the Morgan Library Museum, the Frick Collection, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Zimmerli Art Museum. Eveline will discuss the portrayal of women in Renaissance artwork in the collection of the State Hermitage Museum in Saint Petersburg, Russia. This program is presented in partnership with the National Arts Club, Friends of Phi, the National Trust for Italy, and the Hermitage Museum Foundation. Thank you to everyone involved for making this event possible. And without further ado, let me pass the baton to Eveline. Enjoy the program.
Thank you, Laura, for the lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone who made possible this webinar. And thank you to all of you who are listening. So, as Laura mentioned, today I'm going to talk about the way that women were seen and were represented in the Renaissance by looking at a number of extraordinary masterpieces from the Hermitage Museum. So, being a woman in the Renaissance was not easy. Women's condition did not improve much since the Middle Ages. They were still part of a male-dominated world. They had limited freedom. They were expected to behave and dress according to strict social rules. However, something did change at the beginning of the 1400s. Women became more visible in the society thanks to a large number of works of art representing female sitters. And I'm referring not only to religious scenes, but especially portrait, mythological scenes, and allegorical representation. We're lucky enough that the Hermitage can boast a variety of different examples of women portrayal. They can help us to understand the crucial position the women held between the 15th and 16th century in Italy in their roles as wife and mothers, but also as men objects of desire and icon of virtue. For the Renaissance woman, the most important event in her lifetime was her wedding day. And considering the business thriving behind wedding preparation today, nothing has changed, it seems. But a Renaissance wedding was much more elaborate than nowadays weddings. It lasted for 2 or more weeks, and I'm talking about the upper class, of course, as part of the society, and included complex rituals and public festivities, for example, lavish banquets, as the one painted here by Garofalo. Garofalo was a 16th century painter from Ferrara who specialized in religious painting. And in fact, what we're looking at is a religious scene. It's the moment when Christ, during the marriage at Cana, transformed the water into wine. And this was his first public miracle. However, as you can see when we zoom into the painting, the real focus of attention of the entire scene is the married couple, which is represented on the opposite side of the table, just in front of the viewer. They are paired with a little Cupid and a little dog in the forefront of the painting that do represent love and fidelity. The sumptuous costume of the couple and the architecture of their palace set the event, this biblical event actually, in 16th century Italy, and make us indirect participants of a Renaissance wedding.
What kind of rituals were involved in Renaissance weddings?
Oh, thank you for asking. So I have a couple of examples I can bring up. Can we see the next slide, please? So one of the most interesting rituals, in my opinion, was the commission of works of art. A number of paintings and objects were actually created for the bride-to-be and were meant to decorate her bridal chamber. For example, this fascinating chest, or cassone in Italian. This beautiful piece of furniture was actually meant to preserve fabric and clothing and other elements of the woman's dowry. In Florence, for example, they were a sign of great prestige, and they were made parade throughout the street of Florence from the house of the bride to the house of the groom. These pieces of furniture were usually decorated in an elaborate way, like the one we're looking at, that has a very interesting coat of arms at the center. They were having all these classicizing motifs that make them look a lot like ancient sarcophagi. And they usually were also like decorated with mythological or allegorical scenes that were actually directed to the bride-to-be. In this case, for example, on the sides, as you can see, there are two episodes from two different mythologies, the rape of Deionera and the rape of Europa. Without going into the details about the myth, these two stories are about women that are taken away against their will, which kind of like resonate with what brides-to-be were going to face during their wedding day. They were taken away from their family against their will and forced to lose their chastity. There's also an elusive, not very elusive, quite obvious erotic element in this kind of cassone that we will discuss a little bit later. Not only women, but also men enter marriages, usually against their will, because really the groom and the bride had very little decisional power. Who decided for them were the heads of the family, or either the fathers or a male member of both families. And marriages in the Renaissance had very little to do with love and a lot to do with a business contract. That is proven by the fact that one of the most essential rituals was the end clasp. The end clasp was happening when the two families met together and they signed an agreement in front of a notary, which was a morally binding and a legally binding agreement that was borrowed from ancient Roman law. This plate that was definitely commissioned at the time of a wedding, as you can see, shows the end clasps and tries to make this event a little bit more romantic by adding the burning flame at the bottom and the pierced art at the top, which were two elements related to love according to contemporary poetry. The same gesture appears also in these two beautiful rings, one from the ancient times in the collection of the Hermitage and one from the Renaissance in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I'm showing you two rings with this gesture because very often the ritual of the end clasp was accompanied by the ring ceremony. And the ring ceremony was when the groom would place a ring, a selected ring on the finger of the bride. Usually it was the forefinger, like we do nowadays, the ring finger, because there was this ancient belief that a vein connected directly the heart to that finger. Today, we don't do any hand clasp in Italy anymore during weddings. What we do is we still exchange rings, and that ring in the forefinger is called faith, and that was the name of the hand clasp. Next. Talking a little bit more in detail about the role of women in married life, I would like to focus a little bit of attention on this outstanding painting by Lorenzo Lotto. Lorenzo Lotto was a Venetian artist who had the misfortune to work in Venice in the towering shadow of Titian. And so he was basically forced to work most of his career outside Venice in the Veneto territory and in other regions too. And he was very renowned for his original iconographies and this exceptional and innovative kind of portraits, like this double portrait that we see here. Next, please. Double portraits of husband and wives were another category of paintings that were related to the wedding. And usually, traditionally, they will look more like the one painted on the left, as you can see by Piero della Francesca, with husband and wife strictly in profile, facing one another in two separate panels that were meant to be inched together in the shape of a book. You could actually close it and open it. And in this case, the frame is not original, so that's a different way of perceiving the painting. Lotto totally like changed this very rigid format and transforms it into a more modern snapshot, as you can see. But still, the paintings have something in common, in my opinion. They do represent, in both cases, a not very young couple, as you can see. So they were not really commissioned at the time of the wedding, but they were definitely commissioned to commemorate a wedding and also to commemorate a specific couple.
Why is there a squirrel on the table?
Well, it's very interesting that you pointed out to that. You actually picked the most unusual element in the painting, which help us to understand the very complex symbolism of Renaissance painting. Renaissance painting are often very elusive, especially the ones painted by Lorenzo Lotto. So the best way to try to understand what is the message that they're going to convey to the viewer is by paying attention to the most unconventional elements in the painting. And definitely one of them is the squirrel, Lara, that you pointed out. As you can see, it's a beautiful little squirrel sleeping at the top of the table. And I would like also to get your attention to the piece of paper that the man is holding, which reads in Latin, "Man never," and to the stormy landscape outside the window just behind the man's back. So let's start from the squirrel. So the squirrel, according to the Naturalis Historia by Pliny the Elder, which was this encyclopedic book written in the ancient times, but very popular in the Renaissance, was an animal that was both prudent and industrious. And even if it did not hibernate during the winter, the squirrel used to collect provision, let's say. Next, please. As a symbol of the illuminated ruler, in this case, the Duke Federico da Montefeltro, that we saw portrayed before in the painting by Piero della Francesca, the squirrel is represented in a study room as an emblem of the animal who builds up provisions for the winter. So it's a sort of metaphor of the good ruler who takes care of his own people. In the case of our man, the squirrel is not eating, is not close to a basket with provisions, but is sleeping. And Pliny the Elder says something else about the squirrel, which is interesting. So squirrels were also able to foresee bad weather, so strong winds and storms. And in that case, the animal would stay inside the nest and take refuge. So if we connect this meaning of the sleeping squirrel with the stormy landscape that we see through the window and the motto that man is holding in his hand, "Man never," it's easy to understand what kind of message is trying to communicate to the viewer. The man is basically telling us that he will never do what the squirrel does. He will never retreat to his nest in front of the storms of life, being these metaphorical storms, of course, or real meteorological events, as someone has suggested. Please, next. Beyond the allegorical meaning of this portrait, I think that what really this image stands for is really a celebration of marriage and a celebration of the status of the couple. And if we look closely to the painting, we can have a hint about what kind of role husband and wife had within a wedding, within a marriage, sorry. So as you can see, Lotto pays a lot of attention to the wealth of the couple represented. They're wearing very sophisticated fabrics and precious jewelries. Just would like to point your attention to the luxurious Anatolian carpet that is sitting at the top of the table, like a sort of tablecloth. And there's also a lot of attention given to their gestures, and gestures are never without a meaning in the Renaissance. They always have a very specific meaning. I would like you to notice, for example, how the arms of husband and wife intertwine together to form the symbol of infinity, which is an 8, horizontal 8, as you can see. The woman is represented toward the interior of the room. She's definitely resting emotionally and physically on her husband. As you can see, her right hand stands on the shoulder of her husband, and she's holding a little dog, a tame pet, in her left arm as a symbol of fidelity to her husband. She belongs to the interior part of the room because that's the realm of domesticity that was appropriate for women. The man on the other side is represented more toward the exterior, closer to the window, closer to the troubles of life. and is the active sitter in the painting, is the one that is communicating with us by pointing to the squirrel and showing the piece of paper. And the squirrel, of course, is a symbol of a wild and active animal. Next, please. If we zoom in for a moment into the portrait of the woman without caring about much her identity, there have been a couple of suggestions, but we're not sure about who she really represents. And if we compare this woman to a similar painting, also related to the wedding contest, we can actually try to draw some elements that can help us to understand what was the ideal profile of the Renaissance bride. I don't know if you noticed, but both women are dressed very elegantly. They have very sumptuous clothes. They both have this noble bearing, which signify a good parentage. They both have a very charming face and a very graceful manner, which signify their beautiful character. In the Renaissance, the inner and outer nobility of women was considered, and their virtuous conduct, were considered both essential for the happiness of the household, but also for the public image of the family. And that was, of course, reflected in the offsprings, in the children that the family had. Because women had another very important duty in the Renaissance, one of the most important ones, which was to guarantee the continuity of the family lineage by giving birth to male heirs. Next. Here, I wanted to read with you this passage from the Treatise on the Family by the theorist and architect Leon Battista Alberti, who wrote toward the beginning of the 15th century, because it's kind of very interesting. It provides us with a written portrayal of the ideal Renaissance bride that, in a sense, summarize everything that I said so far and comments even farther on the childbearing duty. And I'm reading a few passages with you. In a bride, therefore, a man must first seek beauty of mind, that is good conduct and virtue. In her body, he must seek not only loveliness, grace, and charm, but must also choose a woman who's well made for bearing children. And I go a little farther down. There is an old proverb, when you pick your wife, you choose your children. All her virtues will in fact shine brighter still in beautiful children. Next. So the second most important event in a woman's lifetime during the Renaissance was when she was giving birth to a male heir. And there are a couple of objects that were actually meant to commemorate this very important event, which are bowls and birth trays. These objects were actually meant not only to decorate the bedroom, but they were meant actually to be used during the delivery, when the woman was actually confined in bed for weeks. And usually they're decorated with allegorical scenes that represent some propitious themes for the mother and child. And very rarely, it's very uncommon that we actually see episode of childbirth. So that's the reason why I wanted to show you this bowl, that it's an extraordinary example of an exception, because we see actually the moment of childbirth. And of course, as you can read from the title, it's definitely not a real childbirth of a woman, of a real Renaissance woman, but it's a biblical scene. But definitely it's set in 15th century Italy. Look at the costumes and the palace. So again, they're trying to bring the biblical episode into the contemporary world. So the woman has just given birth to two healthy, beautiful twin boys, and they look like two miniaturized little men, as you can see. And what is most shocking to me is that a woman seems to not have endured any pain whatsoever. She's kind of being pampered by all these women surrounding her. And this is this highly idealized image has nothing to do with the reality of the time. Childbirth was the cause of 50% of death for women in the Renaissance, and even children did not survive the first few years of age, in most cases. And this was despite the social economic status of women. They were all at risk. For example, the woman that we saw before in profile with her husband, whose name was Battista Sforza, was portrayed in the double painting when she died in childbirth at the age of 26 years old, after she finally was able to produce a male heir and before she had 8 daughters. Next. So as a wife and mother, Renaissance women had a clear motto to keep in mind, and it's not easy to guess who was the model. Of course, it was the Virgin Mary, who was the mother and bride per excellence. The Virgin Mary was humble, was pious, was totally devoted to her child, and most important of all, was very obedient. And so in the Renaissance, more and more often, the Virgin Mary becomes very, looks more familiar, approachable to the viewer. And this is part of a general tendency involving all sacred paintings. Artists really were trying to make these paintings, this mystery of faith, more easily understandable for the people looking at them, to make them more engaged. And in this case, if it wasn't for the halo, I don't know, you would never guess that this is actually a mother and child. This couple looks very familiar. They look like if Leonardo was taking two people from the street of Florence. Well, the artist, in fact, that paved the way the most toward the naturalism sacred painting is definitely Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci is one of those artists that needs very little introduction. He was a remarkable artist, an ingenious scientist who used painting as a way to explore nature. He was also renowned for his endless curiosity and extraordinary creativity that did not meet very well with his tendency toward procrastination. The Hermitage is lucky enough to own two early Madonnas by the artist that are likely to be identified with the two paintings that Leonardo himself annotated in an early inventory of his works in 1482 when he moved from Florence to Milan. And the Benoit Madonna is my favorite of the two, just because you can see one of the most extraordinary contributions of the artist, which is the ability to show the emotional connection between the figures. Next, please. Mother and child here are deeply connected, not only through their bodies, because their bodies are intertwined by this vortex of lines and diffused light, which is typical of Leonardo, but they're also deeply emotionally connected. The mother is completely taken by this child. I don't know if you can read the sweetness in her eyes, and she's totally surprised by the curiosity that is showing for the little flower. Usually the Virgin Mary in this kind of devotional painting she's commonly looking very upset, sad, detached, standoffish, because that's considered to be a premonition of the passion of her child. Here she's totally delighted by this little boy. And the little boy is a little bit more involved by this cruciform kind of flower that is a reference to his upcoming passion, unfortunately. Next, please. I would like to show you another example of this beautiful image of the Virgin Mary and Child. And this one, it's an extraordinary example that the Hermitage owns by the artist Raphael. Another of those artists that needs very little introduction, because along with Michelangelo, Leonardo, he was one of the protagonists of the High Renaissance, this very golden age, like this golden age for the fine arts that actually was considered to be ended with the death of Raphael. So crucial was his contribution to the arts. I wanted to show you this painting only to give you an idea of a different kind of Virgin and Child. And in this case, as you can see, she's a little bit more serious than the one of Leonardo. And this one is an early work by Raphael when he was not yet influenced by Leonardo and Michelangelo. But because this kind of paintings actually were very commonly the wedding gifts that were given to a bride-to-be. And she was going to hang this painting very prominently in her bedroom as a constant reminder of the model to keep under her eyes. Next. Before I show you just the detail of the painting, this is the overall view. And I'm really interested in showing you this frame because actually it's one of the few instances in which we have a painting in its original frame. The frame is extraordinary to see, as you can see, it's highly elaborated and makes the painting looks like monumental and sacred because it's in the shape of a tabernacle, which was the shrine that was meant to preserve the Eucharist of miracle working images. So maybe this one was considered one of those.
So how do you go from the Virgin Mary to nudes?
Well, let's say that the Renaissance woman had a lot of objects in her bedroom, not only images of the Virgin and Child, or beautiful chest, or a double portrait of herself with her husband, but this was another kind of paintings that were very commonly displayed in the married couple bedrooms. So women were not simply seen as devoted wives and mothers, but also as sensual objects of desires. And in this painting, the nudity was kind of like justified by the fact that these are mythological scenes. So the nudity was meant to refer to the divine character of the figure or exceptional beauty. But there is a sensual overtone that we cannot definitely dismiss. Next, please. And let's say that the most erotic and sensual images from ancient mythology are definitely due to the extraordinary Titian, who created this very powerful poesie, or poems as he called them. So Titian, was an extremely prolific and versatile artist that actually was acquainted with the most important figures in the 16th century Europe. He was also, his legacy went far beyond the native Veneto, and he was actually one of the few artists who was honored with a Nobel title too by one of his patrons. So Titian painted this Danae when he was toward the end of his career, as you can see in the self-portrait, so he was already quite established. And unfortunately, we do not know in this specific case for whom he made this painting and where it was originally intended to be displayed. But we do know that this scene of Danae was very much sought after by collectors and patrons, because there are several different versions that were either painted by Titian or coming from his workshop. Next. The Hermitage painting is considered to derive from a version of Danae that scholars believe is a more sensual kind of interpretation of the first prototype of Danae that was actually created by Titian for the King of Spain, Philip II. So Philip II, around the mid-16th century, had asked Titian to create a series of mythological scenes freely taken from the Metamorphoses of Ovid, this ancient book and this poem that actually was a sort of like history of the humankind in the form of myth that were all evolving around the theme of transformation. That's the name Metamorphoses. We do not know why Titian selected specific images, but what we do know is that Philip II was very fond of beautiful women, and in all these mythologies, beautiful naked women figure very prominently in all the paintings. Next. So the story, in order to introduce you to the story of Danae, I thought that I would show you one of the two early representation of the myth that we're very lucky enough to have in the Hermitage Museum. These are two Greek objects dated to the 5th century. One is a crater and one is a ring, as you can see, and they represent the same story painted by Titian. So Danae was the daughter of the king of Argo, who was actually forebode. It was actually an oracle told him that he was going to be assassinated by his grandson. So in order to avoid this cruel destiny, he decided to lock his daughter forever in a bronze chamber in the middle of his palace garden with the only company of her nurse. So nothing was possible because they were not able to prevent the oracle from actually happening, because Zeus was passing by one day and actually saw Danae and decided to impregnate her in the shape of a golden rain. And as you can see in the centerpiece, which is one side of the crater, you see Danae in the intimacy of her bedroom, a very beautiful bedroom. I don't know if you can notice the bed and the pillow, the mirror hanging, and the food stand where she's putting her feet, sorry. She's actually like unaware of what's happening, and she's receiving this golden hair. On the other side of the crater is the moment when the father found out that she gave birth to Perseus, who is this kind of like a very famous Greek hero who ended up doing major deeds, and in the end accidentally did kill his grandfather. So here he found out about Perseus, and he decided to send off both his daughter and his grandchild off into the ocean to die. And in the ring, there is a little bit less sensual representation of the myth, in which Dana is simply standing and receiving in her lap this golden ray that is coming from the sky, clueless about what is happening, of course. Next. As you can see from this comparison, Titian really had in mind the traditional interpretation of the myth, and he does represent, like in the ancient crater, Danae, while she's in the intimacy of her bedroom and receives this unexpected rain coming out of the sky from nowhere, basically. But he makes 3 different choices in his painting, in the iconography of the paintings, that completely transform its meaning. For example, I don't know if you noticed, but the golden rain is now a rain of golden coins. And he also introduced a co-protagonist in the painting, which is the nurse. And she looks ugly and old in comparison to the beautiful and pure Danae, whose status is so high to be able to be elevated to the level of the gods. And instead, the woman represents the immorality of the human beings who just seek only for their personal advantage. As you can see, she's trying to collect the coins for herself. The third most important difference that Titian introduced in the painting is like the overt eroticism of Danae. If there was a sensual hint in the crater, because you can see there are some breasts that are visible underneath the clothing of Danae in the ancient vase. Now there are no clothes anymore. Danae is completely naked, and the viewer is really invited to enjoy the softness of her skin that is glowing like a light that seems like supernatural almost. This is actually one of the best achievements of Titian. He was really able to show the softness of the skin by grinding his color very finely and by adding 15 to 20 layers of paintings at the time to build his shapes. So he was able to really capture the light. Next. I think that Titian really in this painting gives a visual translation to what actually Leonardo da Vinci had already said about the ability of painters versus poets. And I would like to read you this quote, which is very interesting. So painting moves the senses more readily than poetry does. Painters have depicted libidinous acts so lustful that they had incited the spectators to play the same party game. Poetry will never do this. So it's very interesting that from the inventories of the time, we know that actually this kind of paintings were indeed hanged above the bed of husband and wife. And they were used as a sort of an incitement for the sexual connection between bride and groom. So they were very erotic, and the purpose was very obvious. They also believe, many theorists of the time believe, including Lo Battista Alberti, they believe that by looking at a beautiful painting while you were procreating your child, you had a better chance to have a beautiful children too. Next. The sensuality is also the central element of another category of painting which Titian excelled, and this category is called Le Belle in Italian, which means beautiful women. And I found 3 different examples in the collection of the Hermitage Museum. And as you can see, in all 3 cases, even if the ladies are very different, they look all like charming, alluring, kind of sensual in different ways. But they also like detach from the viewer and virtuous. Can we move to the next slide? Definitely between the 3, out of the 3 paintings that I show you, the one that is the most provocative one, in my opinion, is the one by Titian. Well, first of all, the viewer, the sitter is just looking at the viewer directly in a very, very like a provocative way, and equal attention is given to her beautiful soft skin and to her luxurious clothing, the lined fur jacket, and the beautiful hat with the like fancy feather and medallion. There's a profusion of jewelry too. What is most disturbing, in my opinion, about this painting is that she does look like a real person. Next. And this impression is increased when you look at several paintings by Titian where he used the exact same physiognomy over and over again. So scholars have been wondering, was Titian using a specific model? Was this model his lover? Was this model a courtesan? So courtesans were women whose trade was sex, and they were very famous in, very popular in Venetian Renaissance. So some of them actually were quite established for their artistic achievements. They were accomplished musicians. And we do know in some instances that Titian used the feature of courtesans for his paintings. Next. In fact, in this early version of Danae that Titian painted for the Cardinal Alessandro Farnese in Rome, we know from the correspondence of the artist that he indeed used the physiognomy of the lover / courtesan beloved by the Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. And if you look closely, she's not very different in her physiognomy from the Venus of Urbino that we saw just before. Next. So the question remains, what are these paintings about? And how can we explain so many different types, so many different interpretations, and so many different circumstances in which they were created? I think the most plausible explanation is that this painting was created as an open category for the market that could be customized. So sometimes men were asking for a specific portrait of a woman. In other instances, they would just want it like a representation of an ideal, beautiful lady inspired by contemporary poetry. In other cases, they just wanted to have a sensual painting that would induce their wives to act like Venus in the bedroom. And I'm showing you this beautiful painting by Rubens for two reasons. First of all, because I want to show you the legacy of this belle later on in the 17th century, sorry. And second of all, because it gives you an instance of a use of this belle in a very specific context, because this is actually, as you can see, the woman is very similar to the one by Titian, so definitely Rubens were using that painting as a model. But this woman is a real woman. This is his second wife, who was 16 when she married 53 years old Rubens. And she was the artist muse model. He used her over and over again in his paintings, and a symbol of love and sexuality, of course, legitimized within the boundaries of wedding. Next.
Why is that woman standing on that man's head?
Well, we're moving on from it to another category of women. You would never guess, Lara, but this is a very virtuous woman. This woman is probably the most famous biblical female hero that you ever heard of. She is Judith. And she was able to do an exceptional deed. She was able to free her own country by beheading the general of the opponent army. Here she's painted by Giorgione, this extraordinary and still very mysterious artist, Venetian artist, who started a revolution in Venice in the 16th century by introducing new iconographies that we still cannot decipher, by giving more importance to the landscape, as you can see in this painting too, and by introducing the theme of mood and atmosphere as the main subject of the painting. So let me tell you something more about Judith before we try to interpret Giorgione's painting. So Judith was a widow, a very beautiful, pious, and devoted widow that lived at the time in Betulia, in the city that we don't know exactly where it was located, at the time when the king of Assyrians was putting a siege on the city. So after a couple of weeks, the people were ready to give up, and Judith stepped in and decided to take the situation into her own hands. with the protection and power given to her by God and by her absolute faith in God, Judith was able to do the unthinkable. She was able to defeat the opponent army, basically, simply using her beauty, her intelligence, and her virtue. She went to the opponent camp, and she was able to gain the trust of Holofernes, who was the general of the Assyrians, and she seduced him, and then while he was sleeping drunk, she beheaded him. And the moment that is represented in the scene as well, when the triumphant Judith is coming home, and I think the city on the background is actually Bethulia, and she is carrying this triumphal object with her, and she's standing at the top of it in celebration, in a sense. Can we move to the next slide, please? So now that you know a little bit more the story, I want to tell you one thing, that not even for the moment, if you read the story in the Bible, the deed of Judith is ever questioned. She did what was supposed to be done, and she did it in the name of God, and her virtue was her explanation for that. So as such, Judith has always been interpreted and seen throughout the Middle Ages as the personification, the living personification of virtue, triumphant over vice. And as such, she's represented, for example, in this manuscript. As you can see, there's no individualization. She's just like an icon of virtue. Over the time, and especially during the Renaissance and the Baroque period, something changed. The woman, Judith, becomes more like realistic, more sensual. There's more emphasis given to her beauty, and she suddenly, suddenly at that point, her deed is kind of considered ambiguous. And in most cases, in Baroque painting, she's presented as a sort of threat to men. So the sensuality of the woman can be threatening to men if they don't pay attention. Next. I do believe that Giorgione version stands in between these two kind of traditions, because in a sense, Giorgione Judith is still an icon of virtue, because she's not very much idealized, and she's not very much, individualized. She's very much idealized. We don't see real features of a normal woman in her face. And also the way that she's standing and behaving has a lot to do with like a sort of like an iconic image, a personification of virtue. But at the same time, I don't know if you noticed, but there is a hint of sensuality in the naked left leg, which is the leg on which she's standing and squeezing the head of Holofernes. Next. What is more striking to me is the uncanny similarity of this painting to the sculpture of David by Donatello. So it was not unusual in the Renaissance to pair Judith and David, because they both have stories that are very similar. Judith was also this very young boy, was a shepherd, 17 years old, and also invested of the power of God, was able to free his people by killing this giant Goliath and beheaded him. So it's very similar, the story, as you can see. So they were both assumed as sort of like a symbol of the victory over tyranny, the victory, again, of virtue over vice, and they were very prominently displayed in Florence. What is interesting is that Donatello made a version of Judith too. He made a sculpture of Judith. But Giorgione did not use the sculpture of Judith as his reference for this painting. Rather, he wanted to create this strong parallel with David. The posture is exactly the same. They're standing at the top of the head with the same contrapposto stance. They're holding the sword in the exact same way. They have this very similar kind of like mysterious look that I cannot quite read. I don't understand if they are surprised about what they've done, if they're modest about their achievements, or a combination of the two. Donatello and Giorgione had this in common, the ability to really show this kind of very complex emotions, very contradictory at times. And both, as you can see, show a lot of emphasis on their physical beauty, especially Donatello's David, who was completely naked. So the reason for this parallel, what makes this parallel so strong and so powerful, is that really they are really brother and sister in their deeds, because they were both untrained people, young, unprepared, with no weapons. They went alone into this kind of like extraordinary adventure. They were able to do the impossible, armed by the faith in God, and the favor of God is reflected in their exceptional beauty. Remember, beauty is always considered in the ancient time and Renaissance as a reflection of your virtue, interior virtue. The most interesting aspect, the most interesting outcome from the story that I take personally as a scholar, and that in my opinion is very relevant for this talk about women condition, women's role in the Renaissance, is what happened to these two figures after they defeated these people. So David, after he defeated Goliath, ended up later on becoming, as you all know probably, as the king of the Israelites, one of the most famous in the Bible. Judith, we never heard of Judith anymore. She went back to be a widow. She received no recognition, no reward. She just went back to a regular life, which it was kind of, in my opinion, a very clear message to women at that time. You could actually, women were expected sometimes to do heroic acts, especially when they were encouraged by God, but they were never expected to change or improve their status. Next. The last painting that I'm going to show you today, that in my opinion is really like an epitome of the ideal Renaissance woman, is this portrait by Correggio. Correggio was a very famous painter in the High Renaissance, extremely versatile. You can have sacred paintings of Correggio, as well as sensual mythological scenes, small easel painting, and large fresco decoration. You could change from one thing to another with extreme ease. He's mostly popular for these beautiful portrayals of women in his paintings, and I think that this portrait is one of his most famous ones. As often happens with portraits, we don't know the identity of the sitter, which is kind of disappointing, because the purpose of portrait was actually that they were meant to preserve the identity of a sitter for the future generation to come. And the first piece of information that we lose over time is actually the name of the sitters. So all we have in order to interpret who this person might be are the elements in the painting himself. So let's take a closer look to this woman. As you can see, oh, sorry, can you go back? Thank you. As you can see, the woman is definitely a noble woman. She's very lavishly dressed, like the woman painted by Lorenzo Lotto. She has a similar costume because they were not very far in time and the fashion was kind of like the same. She has this noble bearing, this graceful manner. She's very charming, but there's a hint of sadness in this painting. She looks extremely pale, and the color of her clothing are tending toward the brown, the black, the white. And she's also holding this kind of like plate with an inscription in ancient Greek that I don't know if you see, but it's very close to her finger, which reads Nepenthes. And this was actually a remedy that was used in the Odyssey, in these famous ancient poems, to soothe pain. Next. There's these two women, in my opinion. I wanted to show you a comparison with this very famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci, representing Ginevra da Vinci, because the two women are strikingly similar. I don't know if you noticed that.
What are these women wearing on their shoulders?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that they have, in fact, in common. So these women are both, as you can see, kind of like sad and pale, and they're wearing this kind of like it looks like a shawl, but is instead like a small monastic cloak, which is called a scapular, that was used by the tertiaries. The tertiaries were lay women who joined a monastery without actually taking the vows, without having to respect clausura, basically. And usually women enjoyed a tertiary order when they were still married. Like in the case of Ginevra, it's been suggested that Ginevra enjoyed the monastery, representing the far, far distant in the background, when she was still married. And she did that in order to pursue a literary interest, because women could not study very freely. Sometimes they have to really live in a monastery in order to be able and to be free to do so. Another instance in which these women join the tertiary order where when they will become widows. So maybe the woman we're looking at, it belongs to this category, courageous, beautiful woman. Another similarity between these two paintings that I want to point out is that both of them have this kind of like a vegetation that looks like a halo behind their heads. And in the case of Ginevra da Vinci, it's a pun to her name, because the tree is a juniper, ginepro, which in Italian is very similar to the name Ginevra. And in the case of the other woman, we have instead a laurel tree, which could be a pun to her name, because alloro in Italian, so Laura would be the name, or a reference to her poetic achievements. Next. I really do believe that that tree is a reference to the poetic achievements of this lady, and I do believe that the most likely interpretation for this painting is that this is a portrait of the poetess Veronica Gambara, for a number of reasons. So Veronica Gambara was an accomplished poetess who had the fortune to be born in a family with a lot of intellectual females. Also, she married to the Lord of Correggio, where also Correggio the artist was coming from, and he died, and she became a widow then in 1518. After that, she took on the ruling of this small realm until her son was able to do so. Women were never supposed to be ruler for forever. They were just temporary ruler usually. We're lucky that we have 80 poems surviving by Veronica and over 100 letters. And if you read all these writings, you have a clear image of the kind of woman that she was. She was a very devoted wife and then widow, because she never remarried. She was a very caring mother, a very savvy ruler, and a very well-connected humanist. And most of all, she was a pious woman. So all these elements are extremely visible in this painting if you look very carefully. The devotion to her husband is shown by her mourning state, and by the fact, I don't know if you noticed, I forgot to tell you before, but there is an ivy, leaves climbing the branch of the tree close to her face, which is a symbol of eternal love. And also we can see her piety, because she's wearing this scapular, and she has on her knee the belt actually of the Franciscan order, so probably she joined a Franciscan tertiary order. And we can see her achievements in this very erudite reference to this inscription from the Odyssey, that it's actually in the plate that she's holding, and in the laurel tree in the background. I would like to conclude by showing you, and you're free to read it by yourself, two quotes from two famous poems by Veronica Gambara that, in my opinion, really gives you a clear idea of the kind of person you're looking at. In the first one, she fashioned herself as an icon of virtue, which was kind of relevant for a woman in that position. The only way that you could gain respect from people was to preserve her virtue. And the second one, it's a beautiful evocation of an idyllic landscape that, in my opinion, is very much similar to the one that Correggio painted on her background. So what we learned today is that women in the Renaissance had a very difficult life, in my opinion. And since the Renaissance, as women, we came a very long way. However, there is a lot of work that still needs to be done. So my message today is, women, let's team up and fight for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eveline. And thank you again to Friends of Phi and the Hermitage Foundation. And please join us again soon for another NAC at Home program.